introduction to the theory behind what we use as interpreter training, interpreter testing experts. It also relates to people in the education field who just test for proficiency in one language. I'm going to give you a little theory about what we look at when we develop curriculum and we develop tests, because I think it's important for you to have a foundation of what kind of linguistic measures go into an interpreter certification. And then we'll move on and look at some interpreter certification programs at the state and federal level, and some other levels as well, and the requirements for this and what the tests look like. And then we'll end by looking at some resources and professional development opportunities that are available to you. So to start out, this is what is known as the Interagency Language Resource Roundtable. And this is a scale on 1 to 5. And it goes from memorized proficiency, which is basically your survival Spanish or your survival Japanese or whatever it is, all the way up to 5, which is native proficiency. This scale was developed by the U.S. government to test their foreign service professionals, the people that were going to be stationed overseas. They wanted to make sure that they could speak the language of the country they were going to be in. And then later, academia picked up on it and they adapted it for use in educational programs. You have the website there on your handout there, so I encourage you to go to that site and look at the descriptions for these different levels. For interpreters at the federal and state level, we put them right up here at a level 4. And when you look at that site, you'll see the different components of language. It's not only grammatical proficiency, but it's sociocultural proficiency, and it's really knowing how to get around all aspects of the language. And so it'll be interesting to go to that site and look at the descriptions for each one of these levels. There's also interpreter assessment scale at that site too, so that you could see what we would do is look at level 1 through 5, what an interpreter would have to achieve in order to reach one of these levels. So you could look at that. And so how does that relate to the certification? Well, we develop source documents that interpreters have to perform that contain what's described in all these scales. So if you go to that website, you'll see the scales, and I think it's pretty informative. There's that website right up there. And by the way, mainly linguistic competence, because it would test synonyms, vocabulary, reading comprehension. And so that written exam kind of limits itself there. But language and being a native speaker of a language involves so much more. And so this model is very, very important to us as curriculum and test developers, because what we want to do, especially for interpretation, which requires such a high degree of precision and accuracy, is incorporate everything that a person who speaks a native language needs to know. So if you start in the middle with discourse competence, That's somebody who knows how to communicate in a language. And again, it could be at any level, but let's say as a native speaker. These are some of the other things that they will know as a native speaker. They'll of course have linguistic competence, which would be grammar, pronunciation, knowledge of the vocabulary, but they would also have sociocultural competence. Now, sociocultural competence would be knowing the rules of the society where you live in. It would be knowing how to open a conversation, how to interrupt a conversation, how to end a conversation. It would be the ability to express an apology or to say please and ask for something. And that's a really broad area, but a native speaker has that as part of their native competence. And when you learn a second language, you sometimes really have to work at that. And I'm sure we've all had stories of how people make faux pas if they don't have social competence. I know I've made dozens throughout my life. They're always kind of funny stories. And then there's actional competence, which is knowing how to do something functional in the language, like make a request, like to get something, like to persuade somebody. And then rounding it all is strategic competence, and that's how strategic competence would be how to back channel. Back channeling is when you show somebody that you're talking to that you're actually listening to them. And it's like when you go, mm-hmm, yeah, you shake your head, that's all strategic competence. Strategic competence is also being able to repair a message if you make a mistake, so you back up and fix it. And so this model is very useful for educators when they want to create curriculum and when they want to especially create tests, because they want to include this because it shows you know the language, which is a lot more than just knowing linguistics or the grammar of a language. Now, when we come to interpreting, you could put a whole circle around this thing because interpreting takes place in a triadic relationship. So what you're doing is so much more complex because this is multiplied by two languages and then you're being the intermediary. And you're doing an incredible thing with interpreting skills because for simultaneous interpretation, which is interpreting at the same time or a little bit behind the person that's speaking, you're taking in one language, interpreting it in your head, and coming out with the other one. And you're doing it with the knowledge of both languages because you need to use both languages. And consecutive interpretation, where you listen to the English speaker and then hold it in your memory and then put it into Spanish, let's say, and then you do Spanish and put it into English, you're using all of these elements for both languages. So interpreting is much more complex. There's many models of communicative competence, and this is one of my favorites because if you go to the website and look, you'll see that each one of these elements has a big table of everything that's contained in each one of these elements. So I encourage you to take a look at that article there. Okay, so now we'll get into the certification at the state level. The National Center for State Courts is a nonprofit organization, and they're going to be very important to you because they have the contract with the federal government to develop the federal certification exam, and they were also responsible for developing and working with states to administer their examinations for state certification. So basically, the National Center for State Courts is going to be your go-to site to get the resources that you need to study and find out about the exams. So we'll just, let's take a look at the site. So if you go to the National Center for State Court site and You'll see here, I don't want you to go to where it says certification programs, because the National Center for State Courts does so much more than interpreter certification. That is for program administrators at the court level. Where you want to go is to the state interpreter certification. And a lot of the websites I'm going to show you have just a lot of resources that are going to be really valuable for you. Like here's some. They've got related websites, written and oral exam resources, how to study. So this is a very well built site. If we look on, they have a map. So we'll look at this map. So this map is where you'll find out about interpreter certification resources for each state. Now if we look at Arizona, for example, you'll see that Arizona uncharacteristically is way behind everybody else in court certification because they don't have a formal testing procedure. You'll see here where it says Language Access Program website, page in progress. Now there's been a little movement here, and I'm sure that someday Arizona will have examinations that you take. But in the meantime, what do you do when you don't have a formal examination process? Well, what Arizona does is looks to other means to determine if you're qualified. So they would look at your experience, they would look at your education, they would look at other tests that you take, and in some cases around Arizona, they will accept passage of a test that we developed. It's called the Court Interpreter Certification, the Court Interpreter Competency Examination, or Certificate of Proficiency, I should say. I got my acronym wrong. They'll accept passage of that in certain areas of the state. But it's really the wild, wild west out there as far as Arizona goes. There is movement in this direction, and someday Arizona will probably have the same kind of certification procedures that other states have. There's a few other states that don't have formal certifications too, but let's look at California, for example. California has been in the court interpreter certification business for a long time, and they have, if we look at their website here, they have a lot of resources, becoming an interpreter exam information, and here you can find out the basic procedures to go about getting state certification. They basically involve taking a written exam. And this written exam is 135 items. It's in 2 sections. Section 1 is language, so you're going to do synonyms, antonyms, and you're going to do a lot of idioms. And it's all multiple choice. So when you look at this written examination, and it's all in English too. So the written examination is not in 2 languages. You just have to take it in English and you have to pass it before you move on. So if you take the written examination and you pass, then you become eligible for the oral examination. And the oral examination in states that have certification is offered not only in Spanish, but it's offered in Vietnamese, Arabic, Cantonese, Mandarin, Portuguese, and a couple other languages. And so the way the states handle it is they have a 2-tiered system. So if you can take that written examination and pass it, then you become eligible for the oral if you're part of that language group. And then if you pass the oral examination, then you become certified after you attend orientation, and after you get a background check, and after you go through some administrative procedures like get an ID. And so then you become certified, and once you're certified, then you get into the realm of continuing education. And continuing education, you have to, in most states, do 10 hours of training or 10 hours of attending classes to keep up your certification. And all of this is on the website, so you can find out all about that there. They have a second category that's called registered interpreters. So if you're not a Spanish interpreter, then you fall into the registered status. And for registered status, they make you take that written exam, the same exam. If you pass it, then you take what is called an OP. Now, an OP is an oral proficiency interview. And so they want to find that you have proficiency in 2 languages. So you take this interview in English, and then you take it in the other language. So if you were a Pashtun speaker, they would give you an examination in English and then one in Pashtun. In some cases, if it's really a language that isn't used much, they might not have an OP in that language, and then they would have to either create one or fall back on other procedures. But I really invite you to look at California's website because they've been in this business for a long time. There's a lot of resources there. Another state that has been in this business for a long time and is well advanced is Washington. Now remember, when you go to this page, there's a lot of information here. You can find out about salaries, starting salaries, and other opportunities. But definitely check out their website. So if we look at Washington's website, I'd just like to show you, if we scroll down a little bit, that interpreters' information. Knowledge is power, and all of these resources are free. You can get free sample tests, all the information you need from these sites. For example, if we look at resources, can we open resources there? Resources for interpreters. They've got vocabulary development, training resources, interpreter training programs, practice exams, and other resources. And a lot of these are free. In some cases, they will offer practice exams that you could buy for a nominal fee. But there's just a lot of free resources and sample exams within the candidate manuals. And so it's very important for you, if you're going for certification at the state level, to get these candidate manuals and read them. When you take a certification exam, you want to go into that exam knowing the format of the test. You want to know the structure of the test. You want to know what's contained in it. You want to know the instructions of the test, because you save so much time and you got your confidence built up if you know what's on that test, and if you don't have to read the instructions. And this pertains both to the written and the oral exam for the certification tests at the state level. And then once you get into going to these links, all of a sudden, you know how it is, you're surfing on the internet, you get deep and deep into it, and you'll find so many resources that will help you that it's really worthwhile to spend some time doing that. So then the National Center for State Courts also runs the federal certification program. And I might mention that the reason all these resources are available to you, including sample exams that you can take, is because it's really mandated by best testing practices to give you candidate information, to give you sample tests. Everybody wants you to do your best performance, so all this information about the test is provided to candidates so that they know what they're getting into, and also so they could find out if they should be taking the test. For example, in this examinee handbook that is free, and here's how you can get it right there. You just click there and you can download that PDF for free. And it's a big manual, and it has a sample written exam in it, and it has a sample oral exam in it as well. But it also has a self-assessment tool where they want you to answer 50 questions or so, and then score yourself to see if you should be going for certification in Spanish. Now, the federal government, they started out with Spanish because that's really the language of most demand for interpreters in the courts. And then in 1988, they decided to certify Navajo and Haitian Creole because those languages were in regional demand, and federal judges requested that they become certified. So they did that for 4 years, and then they dropped the program for Navajo and Haitian Creole and went back to just Spanish. So there's still some interpreters in Navajo and Haitian Creole at that time that are federally certified. But the program as it runs right now is only for Spanish. So what does the federal government do for other languages? They have a couple categories. One is called PQ, Professional Qualified. And professionally qualified, you can get a professional qualified status and get on the rosters of the courts if you're a member of certain organizations or you've passed other tests. For instance, if you pass the United Nations test, you can get on that list. If you pass the State Department test, you can get on that list. If you're a member of TALS or AAIC, you can get on that list. And because those organizations all either have tests or to become a member, you have to prove that you have competency in that second language and have interpreting experience. And then they have a third tier, which is called language skilled. And really they leave that up to each individual court to determine if they need an interpreter in a language that doesn't have any members or there's no test at the UN or State Department. They leave it to courts to determine their qualifications. And just as an example, this is a really busy slide, but just as an example of what's available in that federal examinee candidate handbook and why you should go to the handbooks for the state and federal level, they tell you areas where they get the documents to make the test. So for the federal examination, you have to pass a 200-item test in Spanish, 100 items in English, 100 items in Spanish. And they tell you that in the reading comprehension, these are the areas where they get the documents to make the reading comprehension. And so they basically give you this information so you can know where to study. It has a usage section, which is knowledge of grammar, error detection, more grammar, and there's some idioms in there too, synonyms, best translation, and they tell you how many items in each section, and they also give you some information on where they get the source material to create the test. So that's for the written examination. So if you want to practice for that test, then you need to take advantage of what they tell you. When you get to the oral examination, they do real well on telling you what to study. And the federal examination has a sight translation from English to Spanish, and they're real fond of police reports. And so I would recommend, if you're going to practice for the federal oral examination, that you concentrate on English police reports and concentrate on using the skills of sight translation, where you review the document and then restructure it into Spanish, and then you get some time to review it before you actually sight translate it on the test, and then render it. It could be pre-sentence investigation reports or witness affidavits too, but all these materials are really widely available in not only in sample materials and in some of these interpreter resources links, but you can search for them on the internet. So if you use Google to search for police report, you'll come up with police reports, and you can find all these documents on the internet if you want to practice. The Spanish sight translation, it could be an affidavit from excerpt from a contract, and so they tell you that. Simultaneous interpreting is always going to be an opening or closing statement. And you can find these not only in the sample test, but by searching on the internet, you could find thousands of opening and closing statements. And as a matter of fact, that's how they develop the test. They go and find these authentic documents that are from real cases, and then they work them into the test so that you're doing an authentic document and it has the kind of language that they want to test. So for the simultaneous portion, what you would want to do is get that document, record it, have somebody record it at 120 words a minute. And so you want to find a document, since it's 7 minutes, so you want to find a document that's like 840 words. Have them record 840 words, and then have them record that in 7 minutes, and there's your 120 words a minute. So you have an authentic test item, or a test section for simultaneous. And remember, an opening or closing statement, what is that? That's an attorney making a case to the jury. And so it could have to do with any kind of crime. You'll never know what they're going to choose for the test. It could be a murder, it could be forgery, it could be robbery. But it really helps to practice those things before you take the test. And by the way, the site translation, English, Spanish, Spanish, English, simultaneous, those are all on state exam too. So when you're practicing for one exam, you're also practicing for the other one. That's the good news. And that also goes for the consecutive. So they tell you the time, and they tell you that it's a direct or cross-examination. So they'll have a witness, and the witness was he's either a defendant or somebody testifying to some crime. And so it's going back and forth between Spanish and English. This section on the federal test, simultaneous witness testimony, this is specific to the federal test, so you won't find this on the state test. But when you look at the candidate manuals, you'll see these differences. So the federal oral exam is a little bit longer because it has this difficult section, which is recorded at 160 words a minute. And it's usually an attorney examining an expert witness of some type. So it could be a Treasury agent, it could be a fingerprint specialist, it could be something to do with DNA. And so those are the kind of topics that you'll see on there. And there's even more information in the manual. This is just an excerpt I'm giving you to give you an example of the benefits that you receive when you go to those candidate manuals. And so that's legal interpreting. And I'd just like to say that I know a lot of interpreters out there who are working without having state or federal certification because this is a booming field. Because of legislation from Title VI to executive orders mandating language access for the courts and for the hospitals specifically, there's a lot of scrutiny and a lot of legislation requiring equal access for defendants, victims in the legal setting, and for patients in hospitals. And it's actually considered discrimination to not give people linguistic access. And in the courts and hospitals, linguistic access means highly qualified interpreters are providing the service because the message has to be gotten across. Otherwise, what happens? People's life and liberty are put at risk. But there are a lot of interpreters, and there's a lot of work for interpreters who aren't certified, either in the legal or medical arena. But if you really want to make a living at this, you have to pursue certification. Because if you pursue certification, then there's just so many more opportunities available to you, either as a staff interpreter, and there's staff interpreter positions opening up all the time. Here in Tucson, Arizona, they had 7 full-time staff positions for Spanish interpreters and several more at state court, and they still hire freelance interpreters on the outside. And interpretation translation is just a booming career field. And that's really a good thing, because that means that people who are limited English proficient are receiving equal access. So now I'm getting into medical certification. And in medical certification, the same thing holds true. There's candidate manuals, there's information about the tests, and strangely enough, there are 2 national medical certifications. And they also have the same model of a written test and an oral test. Now, why are there 2? There are 2 because 2 competing organizations, they used to be together and working on one certification, but then they had different ideas and they split apart. So there are 2 medical certifications that are national. This one is called the CHI. Now let's just take a look at this. This is their home page, and their resources. If we go to the let's go to the top. I think that, yeah, if we go over to certification, we'll look here, and once again, you get just so much information about the test and about how to get certification, how to keep it current. And you'll see a lot of these certification frequently asked questions, and they're real important to look at too, because you all have questions, and they figured that out, and so there's FAQs. They have consolidated a lot of important information there too. So here's a sample test. This is a sample of the test, the written 100 multiple choice items, and it tells you what areas you need to bone up on in order to take and pass that test. So you see there's going to be questions about actually being in the hospital setting and interpreting. There's going to be questions also about anatomy and physiology, but there's going to be a lot of questions about standards and protocol and the ethics, because that's a big part of medical interpreting. There's a lot of information that you can study that will guarantee that you pass that written exam. And then when you go to the oral exam, you see that they tell you that there's a consecutive 4 scenarios, simultaneous, and then site translation of 3 healthcare documents. And if you get into the manual, you can find out more information specifically about what that test is like. Here's the other medical certification. It's called the CMI, Certified Medical Interpreter. And they also tell you, here's a written exam, 51 multiple choice items, unlike the other one, which was 100. And then all these oral exam exercises of sites and consecutives. And so I've given you the websites to these organizations so that you can check them out. Now, back around 1999, before any of those national medical certifications existed, we at the National Center for Interpretation realized that Arizona and the nation needed a certification test for legal and medical interpreters, and so we went ahead and developed one. We developed, we call it the MICE, the Medical Interpreter Competency Exam, and it's a real rigorous exam that is also recognized by many hospitals who are doing their own internal credentialing of their medical interpreters. So we're using this test a lot, and hospitals and other healthcare providers know about it and they recognize it. And this is apart from the national certification because we did this before them. And so you can go ahead and take a look at the different parts. It does have site translation, it has a terminology section, and then it has a consecutive part, and it's about 62 minutes long. But if you pass this test, then you know you're a qualified medical interpreter, it would be safe to say. Let's take a look at this site, because I mentioned that on the written exams for the medical, they ask you about ethics, standards, and protocol. This is a one-stop shopping site where you can get all the different kinds of standards, ethics, and protocol information. So if we look at resources, they give you a lot of other things here too, but the ethics and standards of practice link there, they've consolidated all the things that exist in the medical setting. So before you take those exams, you would want to go there. And if you study those, then the written exam, those parts of it that talk about ethics, standard, and protocol become easier because they're going to ask you questions about confidentiality and about where you position yourself in an interpreting encounter, and you're going to know the answer. So you want to take advantage of those free resources. And there's the link to that right there. Another important site that has a lot of resources that I want you to check out is NAJIT, and it's a big National Organization of Judiciary Interpreters, and there's a link to that right too there. NAJIT also has its own certification examination, and here's something interesting about state certification. If you're federally certified, a lot of states will accept that federal certification. You just pay them some money and make sure you do your continuing education units, and you kind of get grandfathered in to the state certification. NAJIT has an exam, and it's a legal interpreting exam, and it has cites and consecutive simultaneous. It has a written component too. But a lot of states will accept that. If you have this NAJIT certification, then you can pay them some money and fulfill other requirements. And you can find out all about that on the website of the state. If you go back to that map and look at each state, then you should find out what they accept. Of course, they're going to accept federal certification, other states, because that's a more difficult certification to get. And then on NAJIT, you just look at the resources they have. And so they have all of these translator sites, general related links, associations. And if you have the time and the willpower, you can check out everything. Okay, so that's NAJIT. If anybody's interested in certification for translation, this is an organization you want to go to. And again, you should go there if you're interested in getting ATA certification as a translator. And they deal in many, many languages, not only Spanish, but you can find out what the test is comprised of, and you can buy a sample test from them too. Basically, they want you to translate a document that is written in a certain genre, and they want a translation that you do that has dynamic equivalence. In other words, it has the same effect on you as the original source document. So I encourage you to look that up. Now, immigration also has its own certification. Interestingly enough, way back in the early 90s at NCI, the immigration department was suffering under a class action lawsuit. And so they called on us to analyze what was going on in immigration. And so we went and visited immigration courts. And we watched what was happening with the interpreter selection process. And basically, they were using secretaries that worked there in the offices. They were using people that came off the street and just talking to them in Spanish and having a little conversation. It was not a standardized exam or anything. And so you can guess what the result was. When we watched interpreter proceedings going on, the judges sometimes were just sitting there bamboozled because it was gibberish and distortion coming out. And as a result of that, and our work and our recommendations, they moved on to certification of immigration interpreters. And here's how you get to the information about becoming an immigration interpreter. It's buried deep in there, as you can tell, but there's all the instructions for you to check out. Oh, I should mention that I put this link here because if you want to study for an immigration test, I found this doctoral thesis where she analyzed the language of immigration courts. And so I realized reading this dissertation, you get a lot of the great language and a lot of the great scenarios that would be on the test. And so if you're interested in immigration certification, you have this dissertation there too. I mentioned before that for federal certification, if they don't have an examination in your language, and they only have one in Spanish now, so that goes without saying, but they'll accept the UN, passage of the UN test, membership in one of these organizations, the AIIC and the TALS. I'll let you look at those on your own, because all three of these areas have great resources for people interested in certification. And you also get to read about what it takes to become a member of these two, and then what it takes to become a UN interpreter, which is a very high status interpreter position. Unfortunately, you need a third language too that you have a working knowledge of at the UN. So you only need 2 languages in which you can interpret at a level 4, but you need a working knowledge of a third language. Likewise, the State Department, they hire all kinds of interpreters. They hire conference interpreters and they hire escort interpreters. They also hire a lot of translators. And so for each one of these categories, they have tests. And so you go to the State Department in Washington, D.C., and you take the tests, and you can achieve those certifications. And then beware, because if you become certified at the State Department as like an escort interpreter or conference interpreter, you could be on the road for 1 or 2 weeks going with a visiting dignitary wherever they go. But that's what interpreters do. And then here I just have a few additional resources for you to look at. I think you might know these already, of course, the BBC, but I put this here because they've got so many languages there that you can not only read in print, but you can hear audio of. And on news stories, you get a lot of current events, and then you get a lot of crime-related things. And so it becomes really good resource to get language and scenarios, the kind of things that will appear on interpreter certification. So that World Service Languages site is an important thing to check out, as is the online newspapers. You might have seen this. You can get any newspaper in practically any newspaper in the world here. And I put read your way to proficiency because I know a couple individuals who started learning Spanish later, post-adolescent, and they both became certified interpreters, federally certified interpreters. One of them works here in Tucson, the other in Kentucky. And they both became really proficient in Spanish by reading. They're really disciplined. They're really disciplined individuals, more disciplined than me, because they just refused to read English for a long time. But it was a reading where you acquire vocabulary and grammatical structures, and then as you keep doing it, you get more access to the text. And then if you're in an environment where you're speaking, all of a sudden, you see your fluency really shooting up. So I really recommend reading as a way to improve and get your second language up there. This site, A Guide to the U.S. Federal System, that's there because more and more we see that certification tests are going to require knowledge, sociocultural knowledge really, of the U.S. criminal justice system. And so, for instance, if you take that written exam for state court certification, the second section of that test is going to ask you questions about what happens first in a trial. This, or this. They'll give you a series of things, and you got to choose the right one, A, B, C, or D. And they ask you all these questions about legal procedure. There's no reason that you shouldn't be able to study and pass that test. Because remember, a written and an oral examination cycle, you want to get by the written, because it's really the oral examination that, if you pass that, you become certified. And to tell you the truth, the written examinations are a screening device, because the oral examination is much more difficult to administer. not difficult, but expensive. It's much more expensive to administer. And so they want to screen out individuals who don't have the knowledge or language proficiency up front. Here's just an example of some of that site. You should look at that. And then here's Intrans book service. People are always asking about references for interpreters, and this person specializes in selling references for interpreters. And so if you want to find out workbooks or books on theory, books on translation, books on interpretation, check out his website because he's got so much. And then, of course, there's our website, which after a brief period here, if you have any questions, we're going to go on to our second presenter, and then I'll come back and we'll look at some of the training resources that we have here at the University of Arizona and elsewhere. So are there any questions of anybody? Yes?
Which field, medical or legal, do you think has more jobs available right now?
I would say legal has more jobs because it's a much more vast area with, everything from municipal courts to state courts to federal courts to immigration. So I think that's a more vast area. Although what's happening in the medical arena right now with the scrutiny of hospitals and healthcare centers, they're really demanding that they use quality interpretation because there's been a lot of miscarriages of justice happening in hospitals where people's, they got instructions on the wrong medication, they got the wrong organ operated on, or they got a wrong diagnosis, and then it all leads to poor patient compliance. And so it just doesn't work in the medical setting to not provide language access, and it's more expensive. There's been some major lawsuits of millions of dollars because of that miscarriage of justice in the medical setting. And so there's more scrutiny now, in particular with the Joint Commission. The Joint Commission is a nonprofit organization that looks at the quality of services in hospitals. Not only language services, but everything they're doing. But they're focusing more and more now on language services and if they're providing quality interpretation. And so we know that this is a growing area because we're getting calls all the time from hospitals and other healthcare providers about we need to train our interpreters, we need to capacitize them because we're getting the scrutiny. Plus, let's face it, they're interested in patient satisfaction. So they want to do that. And they also realize that it's important because if you don't understand what's going on, then you're really not there. And so there's just a lot of push in the medical area now. If you could do both, then you really could work when you want to if you achieve certification in both.
Do many people go after both?
Yes, a lot of people do. And it takes some work, and some people just specialize in legal or specialize in medical because that's their background, they have a background in it. Or if you're a staff interpreter at federal court, you might not need medical certification. But a lot do, because even in courts, state and federal courts, the medical source comes in a lot. And I mean, in the courtroom, you could have all kinds of medical scenarios that are part of a case. And so even legal interpreters need to know about medical terminology, anatomy, and physiology. You were first.
Does the pay rate vary between when you're orally interpreting or in documents?
Let's say that you have certification, then the question was if you get paid more for being a certified interpreter or being a certified translator. And the answer is not really. I would say that they could be equal because there's a lot of documents, like all the documents that the federal court needs translated and the State Department needs translated, that you could charge 15 cents per word, let's say, and depending on how fast you work, but if you're really good, then you could make the same as a federally certified interpreter. Now, if you find work as a non-certified interpreter, it won't be for like the federal courts because they have to use federally certified interpreters. But there's other work out there for translators, but you might not make as much because they're not going to pay you as much if you don't have a credential.
So certification is always the best thing to do.
Yes, if you're a federally certified interpreter, then you're going to get a lot of translation work. Even if you don't hold the ATA certification, which is the translation certification, if you have federal court certification, then the translation work is immense. And this also depends on the region. And I'm thinking here in the Southwest, there's just a lot of interpreting and translating demand. And it also depends on the competition. Like some places might have more interpreters competing with each other. That's really true of Arizona. There are so many interpreters and translators that have certification, but there's just so much work that it's keeping everybody really busy around here. You had a question?
Yeah, so can I ask you to speak into the mic for the benefit of the people who weren't here? Thanks.
I was just going to ask, so if you're providing all these websites where we can go and we can read the frequently asked questions and then, you can kind of get yourself through that. The point of this course that you guys offer here, is it just to prepare you with the terminology?
You mean the course right today? Or?
Not today, like the actual course like that's offered during the summer.
Oh, well, after the next presentation, I'm going to come back and I'm going to talk about the training opportunities. So I'll answer that question then.
Okay.
And I'll show you exactly what our training programs consist of.
Okay.
Because they do prepare you for taking the tests. They prepare you to increase your skill level in interpreting. And they also help you, like you said, improve your vocabulary and terminology in the legal and medical field. But I'm going to come back at the end and I'm going to show you, I have a few more slides to show you about that.
Okay. Well, I have another question, I guess, related to that. Would it, and maybe you would have to answer it after you go over the last material,
Okay.
But I mean, is it possible for people that are fluent in both Spanish and English to just go through the websites and all that stuff without actually taking the course?
There's people who definitely can practice and study on their own without taking a course. It all depends on the individual. The people that have the motivation to create their own tapes and do simultaneous interpretation or study vocabulary, it depends where you want to get by the written test. You have to study the multiple choice format, and do a lot of reading and take a lot of sample exams. And then when you get to the oral examination, I've known some people who did it on their own. It's just that I think for the majority, taking a course as well as working on your own, you're always going to have to work on your own, I think. You don't get complete capacitation to pass the test just by taking a 3-day course or a 3-week course even.
So I guess overall then you actually don't need to have like a certification prior to taking an exam. If you're going to pay for the exam on your own and take it on your own.
You don't need a certification to take an exam, no.
Oh, okay.
And you don't need, well, I should back up a little bit because this is a really kind of confusing area sometimes because there's so many different things and requirements, whether you're for legal or medical. For the medical certification, they require 40 hours of training. in the medical arena before you even take the written exam. So that's not a certification. That's just that you show that you have those 40 hours of experience.
How about for courts?
For the courts, no. You can just go in there and anybody can take it.
Oh,
You don't need to show any prerequisites. It's different for medical because they have that 40-hour thing. But for the legal, for the state courts, you just show up for that written exam, and then if you pass it, then they start putting you through the hoops. So like I said, you have to do orientation, and then you have to take the oral exam and pass it, and then they do a background check, and you get a badge and all that. And then you get into the world of continuing education units, or like 10 hours a year.
thank you.
You're welcome. Yes?
What is more
Excuse me,
common?
sorry, can you just be patient until I give you this mic? Thank you.
What is more common between freelance and employed occupation for interpreters, or the ratio?
The ratio, I think, would favor freelance interpreters just because if you look at federally certified interpreters, there's only probably under 100 maybe that would be employed at federal courts. I'm just guessing. But freelance interpreters, there's a lot more out there working. And when you're freelance, well, I don't want to step on the toes of the next presenter, so I'll let her deal with that.
Also, how does an interpreter, a freelance interpreter, come to establish its pay rate?
Oh, that's a really good question. And I'm going to let the next presenter answer that too.
Thank you.
That is a really good question, though, and the right person is going to answer it.
Maybe one more question about certification.
What are the benefits, if any, of having an advanced degree in interpretation and translation as opposed to just having a certification?
That's a really good question because there has to be a distinction between academic credential and an actual certification. And an academic credential can come in real handy if you don't have certification because there is work out there for non-certified interpreters, and that is exactly what they would look like. And then if you're talking about a language other than Spanish, then that is a credential that states would look at for that registered interpreter category. And even at the federal level, let's say that you're an interpreter in a language other than Spanish, then you would present yourself to the court and they could put you on a roster of individuals that had that academic credential and experience. Now for Spanish, at the federal and state court level, you need the certification, but an academic credential can be important. You definitely want that on your resume and letter of introduction and all that. It means something.
When people are taking the court examination test, which dominant language tends to do better, dominant English or dominant Spanish?
I don't know. The question was whether dominant English or dominant Spanish does better on the federal written exam. And I really don't know the answer to the question but I think that since those written examinations are written at the same level, so they have identical subsections, and so their reading comprehension, the usage, the best translation, since they're of equal difficulty, I think that it would probably be equal. If you're a dominant Spanish, then the percentage of people passing that are probably going to be the same as the dominant English passing the other one, considering all things equal, right? So let's say two people at the same level of bilingual proficiency. I think it would be equal because they go through a lot of care to make sure that the difficulty level matches in both languages.
So you're testing in both languages.
Yes, on the written exam, it's 200 item test. And so if you go check out that candidate manual, you'll see 100 items in English and 100 items in Spanish. And you got to get 75% of them right. So an important thing is that you don't have to be perfect. You can miss 25 items on each part of the test and still pass.
We're going to take a 5-minute break now. Thank you, John.
You're welcome. And I'll be back.
the offices of the federal public defenders and the assistant U.S. attorneys, and she works as an interpreter, trainer, and translator in both judicial and medical fields for us and out in the rest of the world. Before all of this, it was a occupational therapist. During that time, with a healthy mix of fear and excitement over the years, and with the help of many people along the way, she has managed to develop what is now a flourishing business as a self-employed freelance interpreter. And paying it forward, she's happy to share with you some of the insights she's learned along the way. So please welcome her.
Hello. Thank you and welcome to all of you as well. Yes, can I just have an idea of how many of you are working in Spanish and how many in other languages? Spanish? If you wouldn't mind raising your hands, okay. And what other languages do we have? Sir?
French.
In French, okay.
Swahili.
And Swahili, excellent. And I believe somebody else over here, you sir? Not Spanish?
I'll speak Spanish.
Oh, Spanish, okay, good. I was just curious because of course we know, as John mentioned, here in the Southwest, we have predominantly need for Spanish, and that's what helps our business be flourishing, as Paul just mentioned, because there is so much work, fortunately for us in this area. This is a presentation that I developed with my colleague and good friend Yvette Citizen, and so I'm going to present it today to you. Are any of you already working as freelance interpreters? Are any of you already working as interpreters? Okay, good. So I hope to be able to answer all your questions here. So what is great about being a freelance interpreter? I think these things, a smiley face shows it all. I mean, we have scheduling flexibility. I worked 20 odd years as an occupational therapist, and my schedule was from 8 to 5, as many of you have schedules right now. It's 8 hours, you have a certain amount of break time, and you know your vacations have to go around this. Any time off that you need for medical things or house things is all built around what your schedule is. You take time off and you're going to have to use vacation time, etc. We have freedom here. Another great thing is the freedom to choose what kind of assignments we're taking, right? Just because I'm a freelance interpreter doesn't mean that I have to take everything that comes my way. As a matter of fact, do you think there are times when we should not take certain assignments? Such as when? When we don't know what we're talking about, right? If somebody asked me to go and interpret for a patent conference, I would definitely say no. Okay, I don't know chemistry, supposing it were like related to chemical things. The amount of time it would take me to acquire that information would make it not worthwhile for me in terms of the money I could make charging them to do it. The variety of jobs is, as John already mentioned to you, is a lot of fun. We have translation, we have transcription, forensic transcription, we have interpretation. Do you all know what forensic transcription is? That's when any of the agencies that employs me for judicial interpreting requires a transcript of something that they only have audio or video of, video with audio. So that has very specific rules that you must follow in order for this kind of information to be valid in court, because it can become part of the record in court. And so there's a certain way to do these things correctly. Also the variety of settings. I may be an interpreter, but I can work in any of these settings. So maybe we are just thinking about judicial or just medical, but you may end up going to a school. You may be going on a tour with people who are training to do something, people who come from Mexico for some reason, for banking things, right? So you may be in any setting, which means that you have to be prepared for all these different topics that can come up. And another issue is negotiable pay. I propose how much I want to make. Somebody had asked previously, how do we set our fees? We're going to talk about that later. But if I mention this is how much I expect to get for a half day and they don't agree to it, then I can say, I'm sorry, I can't do it for that, right? So we also have that freedom. Is there a preference as to when questions are asked? Well, if it's related to this, why don't you ask it, please?
Because it's the introduction, you were saying you were an occupational therapist. When did you start? How old were you starting in interpretation?
Interpreting. The question was, since I have another field in the past, and that's something that actually many freelance interpreters have. A lot of us have studied something else or have worked in something else. I actually got certified about 8 or 9 years ago, my federal certification, and I just didn't do anything with it. And in my field that I was in as an occupational therapist, I was starting to get burnt out. And so then you start looking for other options. And this language fallback was an advantage for me that I was bilingual since childhood. And I was able to get enough people to help me and encourage me, and that's why I'm saying over and over, you'll hear me say about being collegial and having a good support system. So what I did is I went from being a full-time OT to dropping to part-time and then starting to take interpretation jobs on the side so I could get the feel for even if I wanted to, because it can be stressful like anything else when you all started the jobs that you currently have. There's always some trepidation and nervousness, right? And so little by little, I saw that that was working, and I started dropping my hours as an OT more and more until I finally just, at some point you do have to take the plunge, and there's still risks, and there's dry seasons, so we're going to talk about that in a moment as well. So what is challenging about being a freelancer? I mentioned one thing right now, that your income is not set. Like before, I'd get a check every 2 weeks, and that was nice. I knew exactly how much income I'd have every 2 weeks, and I could negotiate with myself how much I was going to save, how much I was going to spend, etc. So that's a problem, not knowing necessarily how much I'm going to make or when it's going to get paid, because I can work all of this week and bill for this week and not get paid till 4 months later. Okay, that can happen, and we've actually had problems like that, and then you have to develop a system by which you remember, you remind yourself that you have to tell people that they owe you money still. No paid holidays. Everybody's excited about Thanksgiving and we don't get paid, or whatever. Columbus Day is coming up. Yay, everyone's off of work. Great for us too, but we're not going to get paid. So that's another disadvantage or challenge. Also, in my years as an OT, I definitely took advantage, as any of us do, when we have health insurance that's provided by employers. And suddenly now you don't. So that was another thing that I had to investigate. And as all of you know, it takes time to research what it is, what kind of insurance I'm going to get, how much it's going to cost me, to choose between different kinds. Also, that there is a variety of fields. Now, I mentioned that previously as an advantage, right? Something fun about being an interpreter. So why do you think I mention it here? Because this is what your week can look like, 5 days of work. You start out here with some sort of, working with cows and plants, and then suddenly, boom, I'm in the financial market on Tuesday. Wednesday, they call me for a medical appointment. Thursday, I'm helping interpret in a school. And then on Friday, I'm in court. So you have to have the flexibility and interest to develop knowledge in all of these fields, and not just in English. Maybe I don't know anything about financial markets right now in English. So I have to acquire that language in English and then acquire it in Spanish. So that requires organization, right? It requires us to be very organized. And one is to have professional contacts with whom we can check when we're not sure of where we can get information or how to do things. Colleagues are essential here. It's very hard to just jump in if you don't have some sort of support, and I was very fortunate to get it here. Also knowing what kind of people are going to hire me. Someone had mentioned, so who's going to hire me? How do I find out who will hire me? How do I get in contact with them? How do I show them that I'm good, and how do I get them to be interested in me? We'll talk a little bit more about that. Word of mouth is very important. First of all, always thanking people that refer you. Here we have so much opportunity for work that we actually have to push some away. But we always make sure, you should always make sure to thank the person who refers you. Also to contact anyone who has called you afterwards, after you say you're unavailable for an assignment, and say, I'm not available at this time, but I hope you keep me in mind for the future, et cetera, et cetera. You're starting to establish your reputation from the moment you have that first contact. You need research time. As I mentioned, there's 5 fields there that I was talking about. Okay, I need to have the time to have prepared my knowledge in all of those 5 fields before I accept an assignment. And that can mean saying, I'm going to study this 4 hours, 4 hours every day for the next week before I decide to go and interpret for something that's coming up. Also, you need to be organized in terms of billing and invoicing, because that's very important. You need to get paid, and you need to make sure that your invoices match the requirements of each employer. When you work for the federal government, for example, as I do with the federal courts and federal probation, you have to undergo background checks, so you have to have all that information handy. You have to fill out all sorts of government forms that they require as well. Even the University of Arizona has a series of things that you need to complete before you can work for them. Payments, very important. Again, keeping track of, did I bill, and then have they paid me? Because lots of times we'll have a lot of assignments one after the other, and then poof, you just relax when you finish them, and a week or 2 can go by. I have to confess, I just discovered yesterday that I had not billed for something I did over a month ago. And it's not that I don't want to get paid, right? It's just that time went by and then other things came up, and you're always so constantly having new things to do that you can miss something like that. But fortunately, I do have a system that eventually showed me that I had not billed for that. And work-related expenses, keeping track of those. Can you give me a couple examples of some? And we're going to see them in more detail. What kind of work-related expenses would you have as a freelancer that you don't have as an employee?
Parking, your registration for your vehicle,
Exactly.
gas.
Gas, mileage, right? Continuing education, this kind of thing that you're doing here, if you were a freelancer, would be deductible. Okay, so very important, knowing your status with the IRS. That changes. When I was an employee, I could do my own taxes. Right now, I'm not really comfortable with doing them, so I pay a CPA to do my taxes. And he recommended that I establish a limited liability corporation. So it's just a different taxing entity that you are doing to separate your personal from your business, especially if you start having income that's higher. For example, I am making more money as an interpreter than I was as an occupational therapist. So the income can be good, but you need to really make sure that you're doing things correctly in terms of your taxing and reporting. And by the way, as they say, I'm not playing a CPA here or anything like that, so I'm going to give you generalities about things you should do with IRS, etc., but you always should check with a professional, okay? So one thing that we should do, and that I do, is I set aside about a quarter of all my income because I know that that's going to go towards paying taxes. And we pay them quarterly as self-employed people. So there's 4 times a year that you have to send in a check, and it's called your ES payment, or self-employment estimated tax payment. And there are specific dates. You can look those up online, and it'll tell you when they're due. Like my next one, the last one for 2014 is due on January 15th. It's kind of weird. It goes to the next year. And sometimes after you've paid that, then you end up having to pay more. And so last year, I made my 4 payments, and then I had to pay more. This year, apparently, I'm going to be able to pay a little bit less. And your accountant is who helps you calculate how much you're going to have to pay each time. And there is a penalty if you don't pay this. So there may be a little bit of leeway. Let's say it was October 15 and you paid on the 22nd. You're going to be okay with that. But if you're going over a quarter, then you may start getting the attention of the IRS, and that's not something any of us should want to do.
Sometimes it's more than the 25%, sometimes it's less.
The question was, is it sometimes more or less than 25%? I would say that at least it's going to be 25%. I don't think it would necessarily be more, but that's your cushion to be safe. My CPA in particular tells me to always get an extension. Why do you think that is? Because aren't we proud of, like, oh, I did my taxes, right? Why do you think? Because they're saying if you get an extension, you always have time to go back and correct something or add something. You forgot you bought a new laptop. You couldn't find the receipt. You're giving yourself the extra 6 months to find the information, to fine-tune it, etc. So even if you have everything ready, he recommends getting the tax extension. And also look for someone who specializes in self-employment. Not all CPAs do that. And so when you are trying to find someone, find a business CPA, someone who specializes in self-employment. This is the W-9. Are you all familiar with this? Okay, you will be filling out a lot of these. Each time you have a new client, this is what you're going to have to fill out. And on it, you will fill at the bottom the employee identification number, the EIN, or tax ID number. It's a 9-digit number that will be assigned to you once you establish your LLC. And that's how you would start billing, because you don't want to bill as an individual anymore. At that point, you want to bill through your LLC. So when you fill this out, you will fill out the section that says business name. And these are the much hated vouchers that we have to send out every quarter with the amount that he mentions. So I send out my little check and I fill out the corresponding information here. Actually, he does that for me. And then I photocopy or scan before I send it out. So I have a register, a record that I sent it out. And then, of course, it gets cashed like this. It's amazing how quickly they cash our checks. I think I sent my last one out on a Monday, and by Tuesday it was already showing the money was gone. Very sad. So these, you can also download this stuff. If you feel confident that you can do it yourself, this is something you can download from the internet. And of course, there's 2 more. I'm just showing you the first 2. So what is critical here? Keeping accurate records. The first year I did this, I was kind of like seat of my pants, and I was still really generating income as an OT. And so keeping records was not my priority. And then I went to the CPA, and he charged me a lot more because it took him a lot more time to extract from my records the information that he needed. So he suggested he gave me some ideas of some things to do, and I talked to another CPA who set up an Excel spreadsheet for me. And then the next year, which was last year when I went to him, he was so happy. He charged me less because all the information was already there. Makes a huge difference for your peace of mind and for the information that you need, that your accountant is going to be working with. Now, there's all sorts of specialized software. If you guys are do-it-yourselfers, I'm sure Quicken has one for self-employment. I haven't done it myself for a long time. Of course, keeping a record on the computer. You can use programs such as Google Maps or any of the other mapping programs for mileage. Some people like to do it pen and paper in their car. I'm not one of those, so I'm not organized or continuously organized enough to do it that way. As I mentioned, I got my own Excel spreadsheet done. Now, receipts are something that you need to keep track of carefully because, at least for us women who have purses, it's easy to just stuff things there and then forget about them. I don't know what gentlemen do. So you guys don't have that luxury. Maybe you fold them nicely in your wallet. But this is something that at the end of the week, what I have now is a system where it's a little basket. I put everything in there, and then on the weekend, one of my fun things I do, I know it's such an exciting life, is I distribute them in the folders that correspond to some expenses. And I'll show you how that works. And then backing up your data periodically. Kudos to you if you do everything on your computer, that's great, and then it crashes and it was all for naught. So make sure that you back up frequently. What I do is I have a spreadsheet and I email it to myself once a week. Is that the best idea? I don't know, but it's worked for me because sometimes I don't have access, I don't have my computer, but if I go to Mexico and I'm with my family there, I can still pull it up and verify something. Especially payments are what sometimes you want to make sure that you can verify. Okay, so here are some of the examples. Cell phone, what do you know about cell phones and business self-employment right now? Can I deduct the entire thing? Yes. Actually, no. They told me that no, because a cell phone is assumed to be part of your business. If you have a landline, you could. But if you don't, which the majority of us are starting to not, how many of you here still have landlines? See, that's 2 out of a group of maybe 15. So a lot of us that only have cell phones now, you cannot deduct the entire thing. Your accountant will tell you what percentage of that you can do. The same thing goes with internet access. But other things are 100%. Advertising, office supplies, business lunches, membership fees, all the associations that John mentioned, ATA, Najit, etc. You can become a member of them, and those dues are deductible. If you go to their annual conferences, same thing. Parking, of course, you're parking for today. So here's an example of my spreadsheet, just because I am not good with Excel, so this was a learning curve for me. I don't know how many of you are really good at this, but this was very helpful. This is an idea of my revenue. So you can see in green is the one that I've gotten paid for. In 2014, I only worked about, 7 days or something? I'm kidding, of course. So this is a summary, but I made $19,000. That's pretty good, right? And everybody is Smith, by the way. It's interesting. But the green is the people that have already paid me. So this is a running tally, right? Now, once that's there, then I filter my amount billed here by color. So it'll only show me who hasn't paid me. Because otherwise I'll have like green and some that are pending and green and pending. This is just so that you could see that I mark those. And then I would go through and say, just show me the unpaid ones. And that's when I realized, that I have not been paid for something. Doing it this way is really great because I can also filter and see how much I made in January of this year versus January of last year, okay? So you want to learn to do those functions on Excel spreadsheets if you don't know how already. You find a friend or you pay someone to do it for you. Very important is this column right here. Why do you think? It says paid and deposited, right? Why is that important? Because we're a cash basis, which means it doesn't matter if I bill today. If they pay me in 3 months, that's when I have that income, not when I billed. Okay, so it's when I deposit that money, that's what my taxes must reflect. So a couple other things that you'd keep track of is the invoice. You need to develop an invoicing naming system. So mine is the name of the person or the type of job I did, what day I billed, and then the year. And then comments at the back, things were canceled or whatever, no? Okay, and then this is the expenses. So that was how I was making the money, right? And these are my expenses. And on this sheet, as you go across, I know it's tiny and you can't see it, but as you go across here, it says Office Max, and on the date X, the payment method, I use my credit card. You will have a credit card only for business. We'll talk about that in a moment. And then it says what the amount is. $100, 25 of which were photocopies, for example, and 75 of which was computer-related things. And at the end, it tells me, oh, yes, it is 100. And there are formulas that this person put in there for me to tell me that the amounts are matching up correctly. And in the end, again, I can filter by seeing how much did I spend in January, how much did I spend in February, how much have I spent at Office Max, that kind of thing. A lot of these businesses are now emailing you receipts, which is really cool also because you have an additional form of keeping track of them. And then you have to organize, take all those receipts and put them in folders corresponding to each one of these sections. That was one thing that really helped me last year that I had not done. I have a folder called Office Expenses, one called Advertising, one called Travel, etc. So they correspond to each one of these columns. Makes it much easier. Okay, so additional tax deductions, some of those you've mentioned already. And your utilities at home, electricity, water, sewer, garbage, all of that. How many of you are thinking of having a home run business? I don't think a lot of us actually like set up an office somewhere, right? Most of us are going to be working from home, so these are good things to know. Okay, and so then some of the more common expenses you'll see definitely is a cell phone. Again, these are a percentage. Water, TEP, I mentioned. Parking. And your mortgage, there's a percentage as well that your accountant will deduct based on the square footage of your home. He'll help you estimate, you tell him what the size of your office is, and it has to be a space exclusively dedicated to your work. Okay, so here we have to keep our fiscal year separate. We said already you're a cash basis, so it's the deposit date that matters, not when I was billing. We have our sheets, clients, etc. And your list of clients will grow huge over time. So here's the fun part, getting paid. I think I already showed that to you. Okay, so you need to establish a separate checking account and credit card. This is vital because otherwise things start getting mixed up and you need to really adhere to following those. Only the credit card for business should only be for expenses that are entirely business related. Also, they'll provide you quarterly reports, which is nice, and they also provide backup information. Okay, so additional expenses. The end of the year is coming up for me right now. I'm into ergonomics big time, so I've decided I'm going to spend on a keyboard. I want to upgrade my keyboard. I'm going to spend some nice money on that. That's going to be deductible. Anything that you think of that is specifically work-related is something you can deduct. Software as well. Dragon, have you guys heard of Dragon Naturally Speaking? Okay, that can help with transcription. That might be $200, but it's going to be deductible, so it's a good time to get it. Other things that you'll have expenses related to would be health insurance, E&O insurance. Have you guys heard of that? Errors and omissions. A lot of professions, if you're a doctor, you have insurance, right, for problems that you may cause. If you are a therapist, we usually are covered under the umbrella policy of a hospital. As an interpreter, this is an optional thing. I can tell you that I personally don't have it. I only know 2 or 3 people who do. And that's in case you're doing a translation and for some reason you translate something incorrectly and it ends up costing the company some sort of money that it might come back to you. This would cover that. And it's not very expensive. And disability insurance, that's just something, if I have a cough, like you may hear I'm a little sore, my throat is a little, I'm not talking very clearly today. Let's say it starts getting worse and then next week I can't speak, I can't work, right? If I can't talk, I can't interpret. I can translate maybe. So disability insurance, of course, that would be for long term, but it's something to keep in mind. So how do I advertise? This is really important. By just joining some of these associations, you are automatically advertising, if you're joining, because it'll say what your specialty area is, what your number of years of experience is, what your languages are. Some people speak languages that are very highly in demand that are not Spanish, and depending on the area, you can get called from anywhere in the country. Phone interpretation is a big thing right now as well. And then if you're certified, those agencies are usually going to advertise you as well. They're going to have lists that show what people are certified. And word of mouth, as I mentioned, is very important. So as you're working, people are going to speak about your work. So that's why you want good things to be said about you. Other things that you can do are advertising in the local bar directory. But these things may have a cost, right? Business cards, simple brochures, I think it's common sense things that you can think of. How many of you are into social media? Good. It's usually the younger people, so go younger people. The rest of us are having to learn and put our effort into doing that, but you guys have that big advantage, so take advantage of it, definitely. A couple other quick card ideas here. You need to get business cards done. Having a website is optional, but it's very helpful. And be willing to take jobs that aren't necessarily going to be very, they're not going to pay a lot. Court reporters also are people who look for us, secretaries of attorneys, etc. Somebody had asked about fees, whether you're certified or not. Here's a very clear difference of what you can earn if you're a federally certified interpreter versus not. So in the federal courts, they will only hire us. They have to show that they couldn't get a federally certified interpreter before they go to a non-certified. So this is our rate, and this is the non-certified rate.
Does that count for medical too, or is that just for court?
The question is, does that count for medical? Definitely not. That is for courts. Medical usually is a field that is still paying less at this point. And of course, you talk in advance with your client of what you're going to charge, send invoices immediately. We said that. And I put this bottom thing of payment due within 30 days in quotes because you can put whatever you want on there and they're still going to pay you kind of whenever they pay you. So that's why you have to plan carefully what your expenses, et cetera, will be because there's no guarantee of time. Letters, I normally don't work with contracts unless it's something like the government or the university usually. Otherwise, it's kind of like an email. If you have it in email that I'm going to charge this much and have it due by this date and you're going to pay me, within a certain time frame, that's usually been enough. We establish minimum fees. Like I won't work unless they're willing to pay me 2 hours. Okay, because it usually means going somewhere, right? And then coming back. So I'm not going to go work and just get paid for 1 hour. You can even say 4 hours. And here's the idea of taking smaller jobs that might be helpful, specializing in one field. Let's say you're a chemical engineer and now you're thinking of being an interpreter. Chemical engineering is probably going to be something that you're going to be very good at and master a lot more easily than something you'd have to prepare for. Okay, every client's important. I think these are common sense things for any profession, being professional, showing up on time, doing a good job. The ethics courses that you will be required to take are very important because we do see lapses of ethics among colleagues sometimes, and you don't want to be that one person that they say, oh, don't call him because, I hired him to come help me with interpreting, and then he went around giving his business card, and I lost some clients. That kind of thing, where these are things that should be common sense but don't always happen. Sometimes if we have a lot of time at one point, we double book, and then suddenly none of the two cancels. It's good to have someone else, but you have to notify your employer, the person I'm going to send, Miguel in my place, right? This is again related to having someone cover for you. And again, when I first started, I would talk to people who had a lot more experience than I did and ask them, how do I charge? And that's what's really helpful, to have someone you can talk to. And they would say, I charge X. Well, if I just started and they have 10 years experience, I don't really feel I should charge as much. And that's what I started doing. I wasn't going very cheap, because if you go very low, then you are, underbidding, right, every other job. But I also knew that I wasn't on par with some people that had a lot of experience. So you're going to learn how to kind of do that little balancing game. Now, of course, I charge more than everyone else. No, that's not true at all. And then just this little phrase here on the bottom just means that, being a good colleague is something that's very appreciated, and it always comes back to you in a good way. So always keep your options open. You might think, I don't want to do this, but I keep getting calls about real estate. Maybe I need to start learning about real estate, because that could be a very good source of income for me, even though it's not my preferred field, right? Conference interpreting is a lot of fun. I like that a lot. It's very stressful. But you get there and you're working with colleagues, and it's always going to be two people, and that's a lot of, it's exciting to do conference interpreting, and sometimes it's a little hard to break into it. But again, by being a good colleague, you're going to get referred. Lots of times they ask you, who do you want to work with? And so you can refer someone that you work well with. And a lot of times you're having to educate the person that hires you, because they may not be familiar with really that yes, I'm an interpreter, but I can't work for 8 hours straight.
Why are two required?
When you're doing conference interpreting, you're doing simultaneous interpreting. So maybe you all know there's consecutive interpretation, simultaneous interpretation, and sight translation. When you're doing simultaneous interpretation, it's very tiring. So the most you can probably do continuously is 30 minutes or so, and then after that, your accuracy starts dropping. And so this is a way that you switch out back and forth. You'll see your brain is fried at the end of an 8-hour interpreting day. Okay, and you always try to, stand out and be someone that goes a little bit beyond the other people. There's a lot of competition. Don't worry about it. You're just going to do your job and do it well. Other people are out there bidding for the same job. Lots of times several of us friends bid for the same job, and then we're like, oh man, they gave it to you. What did you offer that I didn't offer? It's going to be out there. Just accept it and just do as much as you can to facilitate your colleagues or your own good outcomes. Okay, so networking, this is something I've mentioned, I think, as we go along. And one thing that people don't think about too often is that sometimes volunteering is very helpful. I have a friend who started volunteering at her church, and then at the church there was a physician who was having to have someone interpret in his office, and so he called her. And then suddenly she's now got, like guaranteed 10 hours a week working at a doctor's office, and then from there something else might come up. So you never know what those little connections, what that ripple effect can be. And she started just volunteering. And who can answer this question for me?
You can be my mentor.
What is a mentor? For $500 an hour, I can be your mentor. No. What do you consider a mentor? A mentor would be anybody who's willing to share information with you, right? And I think that really is that pay it ahead, pay it forward thing. If you go into this field, you come to it with a wealth of knowledge, and it would be great that you are willing to share that with the next people coming up. You don't have to see everybody else as a competitor. You really can see them as a colleague. And hopefully this has been helpful. So I think, is it time for questions? All right. And just remember, please, to give Courtney time to bring the microphone to you if you have specific questions. Any questions?
I had several that I wrote down as you were going along, so if you don't mind.
No problem.
How much did you have to invest, or did you have to invest at the beginning when you decided to go into freelance? Like, how much kind of capital do you have to have available for your resources, for your technology, that kind of thing, before you start?
I would say that fortunately not very much. What you invest really is the time in having to learn all of these organizational things. I already had a computer. My brain was already there. So it was just a matter of having to fill it with other specific things. The contacts, I think also the time in terms of making contacts and trying to explore it. But no equipment is necessary, right? You just have to be able to get to the job and do it.
And I don't know if you said that you did some of the accounting or tax process on your own to begin with. Would you say it's worth the fee that a CPA would charge, as opposed to spending the time doing it yourself?
Oh, for me, definitely. But I know myself. I'm not a numbers person, and you'll find that a lot of interpreters are not. I don't know if it's that right left brain thing.
Yeah.
But I also need someone to be telling me, it's time to do this, I can give you an idea, like my tax prep, he charged me $300 this year. It was $350 last year, the first year when I was more disorganized and everything. And another good thing is that you can write them throughout the year. I ask him, what about this? And we're going back and forth with questions. To me, it's completely worth it. And it's a tax-deductible expense itself.
That doesn't seem like very much.
No, it really doesn't if you think about it. Yeah, I went in there not knowing. I mean, it's going to be $800. I mean, how much am I going to have to pay? And it's not outrageous.
And last question, when you talked about your research time for certain assignments, do you charge for research time at all? That's something you do, like, as a personal professional?
It is something you have to do. You cannot, you could try maybe to incorporate that into something you're going to charge, but that's your responsibility. Let's say they contact me about a chemical patent thing that they want me to translate. I can't charge them 10 hours for me to learn what is a patent, what are the, I don't know chemistry, let me learn some chemistry. I shouldn't take a job that requires me to spend too much time, or I can take it and just know that I'm not going to make money off of it because I have to spend that much time researching it.
You might have some background information but need to do some additional.
Right, and I think for most jobs you really are going to want to. I did one on a conference on endovascular procedures, and I like the medical field, but I'm not an interventional surgeon, so I had to go and research things. And the fact that we have the internet is such an advantage because I can look up videos in Spanish of surgeons doing things, and then videos in English, and then make glossaries and then look up diagrams of how the cardiovascular system works. That's the kind of thing you need to be willing to do with your time. Mm-hmm. Yeah, you're welcome.
Can you check that mic is on?
If you go to court and they've got the listening devices
The
or
headsets?
the conference, is that always provided to you, or do you have to have those?
In courts, they will be provided. I can't say they're all good quality. Federal court's very nice. Some other courts that you may go to, the equipment will be provided, or there is no equipment. But I don't think you would necessarily bring your own at that point. There's still a lot of courts where you're doing chuchotage, right, which is where you bend over and you're like this for an hour, and then you're interpreting into the ear of the person who needs your services. Okay. That's not fun for ergonomic reasons, for throat reasons. Whispering is very strenuous for the vocal folds, okay? And so that's something that as much as possible you'd want to avoid. But the federal court definitely has equipment, Superior has nice equipment, and then after that there may or may not be equipment. And that's a little bit of a technical hurdle as well. If you're someone who's nervous about equipment, you have to practice before you go out there. Any other questions?
So I have some questions that are being submitted online from people
Cool.
who are listening online. So the first one, I'm just going to read the question. She
Okay.
said, I am currently in law enforcement and I have been interpreting for the last 11 years, but not hired for that purpose. She also said, I have 10 plus years in the medical field interpreting as well. Will that experience be taken into consideration with interpreting?
If you want to get certified for, as John mentioned, you don't require, for judicial interpreting, you're not required to show that you have a certain number of experience, or certain hours of experience. For the medical, it is a requirement, not only to do that 40-hour course, but also to show that you have a certain number of hours of interpreting experience in the medical field. So that will definitely help you for the medical. For the judicial, basically, it's just a big advantage that you have all that in your linguistic experience already. I hope that answers the question.
And another quick one. Somebody asked if you charge the same at state courts as you do in federal courts.
I'd like to, but I won't get paid the same. So you can charge whatever you want, but they won't pay you as much. Definitely state courts do not pay as much. This is federal, and because you're federally certified. The state courts will take you, if, for example, here in Tucson, if you have passed, I think the consortium is not really an option here in Arizona, but there's a test called the CICP that NCI offers, and you have to have that. That is a requirement. But even so, the pay is not the same. It's not comparable to federal certification. And that's something that they will establish. That is not a negotiable thing where they will pay you this and they'll pay the other interpreter something else. That's a set fee that each court would establish and that you have to be willing to take if you're going to work for them. That's it? No other questions?
Yeah.
You can ask it and I'll repeat it.
When did you start interpreting? Like, legal or?
I started probably as the person online was doing. As an occupational therapist, they would always call me to interpret medical as I was working with patients. Can you come here and do the history and physical, let's say if I was in the hospital, to assist the physician with that. Or the therapist when they were taking a history or giving an exercise program, etc. The judicial I did just because I am fortunate to have one of my mentors is my sibling, and he was federally certified, and he pushed me to, come on, do this, do this. So that's why I actually took that step. But the medical was just because that was my job, and you'll find most of us, as I mentioned, have other fields that we've worked in, and so that's an advantage for me. It happened to be medical.
And also, you were saying simultaneous is more strenuous to do. I didn't follow exactly how long can you persist doing simultaneous and how long consecutive?
The question was whether simultaneous is more stressful and maybe how long you can work or should work. They've done studies, and what they find normally is that 30 minutes is a good cutoff point After that, you need to rest for at least 30 minutes, and then you can jump back on. So you're alternating. That's why you should normally require to be part of a team of interpreters.
Are there guidelines for this that we can find information?
Well, I think they published one, and maybe John can talk about that when he comes back.
I would say, yeah, the NAJIT page that I give you the link to, if you get on there, look at their position papers. They got a position paper on team interpreting. And so they explain the origins of the policy and why it has to be that way. And so it's been really accepted in the field for professional interpreters.
Mm-hmm. And maybe it's specific to judicial, but I see no difference in any kind of interpreting where you're having to concentrate and really master very complicated, specific language. So you were going to say something?
I have a question. So I will tell you first that for interpreters for the deaf, sign language interpreters, they have a much more rigorously established policy such that you'll have at least 2 people team interpreting almost no matter what. With spoken language, it's not quite as rigorously held. But my question to you is, if you're freelance and you find yourself in a position where you're called upon to do a job where you're going to be interpreting for 4 hours, what do you do? Do you take a job like that, or
I'm going to step into the theoretical world here and say, no, never. I would require that in order to be professional, I will only work as a part of a team so that we can switch off, etc. And I will step into the reality of it and say, I have done that. But I would not do it for judicial, I can tell you that. Okay? I think it's going to be dependent on what the field is and how comfortable you are with it. But even so, you really shouldn't do it. I did that in my greener days. And so I have learned that I probably would not do it again. I actually did one day that was at least 6 hours of interpreting solo. And what's another problem? Your voice, right? Mm-hmm. We're not meant to use this tool for 6 hours continuously. Mm-hmm. So, and they're not going to stop really necessarily for you to drink and relax, Yeah. In court, the interpreter can request a break. So that's one thing, right? Even if you don't have 2 people, but you should always be team interpreting for simultaneous.
Irene, I'd just like to ask you, for some of us, we're pretty new in this area. What would you say helped you the most to become a better interpreter? Like, is there any readings that you can recommend, or like things to do other than, obviously we have all these websites, but what was the main thing that helped you as an interpreter?
I think my advantage was built in with no merit of my own, which was having attended school in Spanish. Okay, so that gave me a lot of experience with reading in Spanish, and it gave me a wider vocabulary. But as John mentioned, though, that is not an absolute requirement. Those 2 people that he mentioned that learned English as adults, you can overcome that, right? So and what I would recommend to you is reading a lot in Spanish. And that doesn't mean magazines or the Yahoo homepage in Spanish, right? What I'm talking about is, it doesn't have to be El Quijote either, right? It doesn't have to be literature. We're talking about something that gives you the ability to acquire vocabulary in a lot of different topics. There's all sorts of websites. You can read the news, of course, because you're going to see things that are of current events. If you're interested in particular in medicine, you could go something like to Medline Plus and start reading about the heart in Spanish. And then reading about, something related to orthopedics in Spanish, and then jumping to the English page to see, okay, this is how you would say it in English as well. But it has to be something that you do on a daily basis, because we talk about heritage Spanish speakers and the fact that we speak Spanish at home maybe, but it's not the same thing as the level of Spanish that will be required when you're interpreting. So I would recommend putting that on your everyday. We eat every day, we go to the bathroom every day, we should be reading and making an effort to do that in Spanish every day. It's just non-negotiable.
Thank you.
Or
You're welcome.
You're less confident language.
I'm sorry, yes, exactly. Whoops. Correct.
So I want to ask kind of a 2-part question. You don't have to answer the second one if you don't want to, but on average, how many hours do you say you work a week, and what would you say your average yearly income would be?
I'll give you a range on the second question. How many hours a week I work is very variable. As I mentioned, a lot of times I can't take any more work because I might work 8 to for, let's say, at probation, they keep us pretty busy. We're doing video teleconferences for them as part of the pre-sentence investigation and the reports they have to do. So I might do that for 6 hours, and then I come home and I'm working on a transcription. Right now I'm working on a transcription, and those are hours that you do at home, work that I'm doing at home. So hours, probably close to 40, sometimes over 40. Sometimes I say that's enough, I need a break. Like if I've taught and I'm working on a transcription and there's a presentation and then I'm, interpreting and maybe doing a translation as well. Sometimes I say, you know what, I'm taking off Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday. That's it. I need a break. And as far as my income, I can tell you that it is more than as I made as an OT, and it's between 65 and 80, roughly. And I suppose I could work many more hours, but you have to give yourself a break. I have a friend who says Sundays, not for religious reasons, but because I need a break, I'm not going to work anymore. And so that day she does not transcribe, she does not translate, she does not research. That should be a mental day of rest, and we need that as well. That's one risk of being a freelancer, that you can go 7 days a week for months and months and months, but it's not good for you.
I think that we're out of time actually for questions for Irene, but I want to say thank you for paying it forward and sharing your experience, tools of the trade, and how you got to where you are now. I know Irene will be available for you afterwards if you want to ask her more questions, or perhaps you can write to her as well. Thank you very much for sharing with us today.
You're welcome. Thank you for being here.
So we're going to move right into the final part of our presentation tonight, and John's going to come back up and talk to you about training options, and there are quite a few here in Arizona, and he's, okay, couple of minutes break, never mind.
Whatever our language levels are, we're as good as we are in each of our languages in the areas that we're used to talking about, right? If you're not a lawyer or a businessman or something like that, maybe you don't have a lot of knowledge about contracts and the kind of language you'll find in contracts. Maybe that's the kind of thing you need to learn. But in addition to that, training. So you need to bring languages, but then also train as an interpreter to get the practice of moving back and forth between them without losing the meaning of the message. So I just wanted to add that.
Thank you.
Okay, so we're going to end talking about some local training opportunities for Spanish interpreters. Now, we've done some non-language specific trainings in the past, and since we don't have materials in like Japanese or Arabic, what we've done is provide a lot of information about the standards, ethics, and protocol, and then talk a lot about the 3 different modes of interpreting, which are consecutive, simultaneous, and sight translation. And that kind of training boosts anybody's interpreting proficiency because they learn the techniques and the theory behind those interpreting modes, and so they'll improve their performance. what we've done in some non-language specific trainings is get language pairs together. So I remember one time we had 2 Vietnamese interpreters, and so we were able to use our scripts in English so that they could role play. One of them would have to sight translate into Vietnamese so the other could interpret it for a consecutive, but we've done that before. And around the country, there's really not enough training for other languages than Spanish. However, there is some, and if you look at all those websites that you have in that presentation, you'll see that there are resources for other languages. Specifically, I can talk about, these are the 2 manuals I printed out for the state court certification, the written and the oral. And in the back of the oral manual, you'll find all kinds of resources for languages other than Spanish. So when you look at those, if you have a language other than Spanish, you would want to check that out. But let's talk locally about what we have right here in Tucson, Arizona, which is really a hotbed of interpreter training. We have the best things right here for Spanish interpreters. The Translation Interpretation Program at the University of Arizona, we'll look at their homepage. They're unique in the sense that I believe that it's the most comprehensive interpreter translator training in the program because it deals with interpretation and translation, and it deals with legal and medical field. And so it's really a wonderful program. We developed the curriculum for it at NCI. And then we managed to get a pipeline into this undergraduate program by teaching instructors, Spanish instructors in local high schools to bring translation interpretation instruction into their classrooms. So then there's so many talented Spanish-English bilinguals in Tucson high schools at all of our local high schools, especially certain ones that where most Hispanic kids study. So we targeted the heritage language speakers there, we targeted the advanced placement kids there, and we got the teachers to teach translation interpretation there. The idea was to get them to stay in school to appreciate the value of their bilingual skills, and then to come to a summer program we offer, and then get so excited about translation interpretation that they enroll in this program. And so we've created a pipeline through different programs of getting the talented bilingual kids into this major. Now you can major in this program through the Spanish department, Spanish and Portuguese department, or the Mexican American Studies program. So you can major in translation interpretation through that way, or you can get a minor. So we have a lot of people who are in business, who are in law, and in those fields, if you have this bilingual translating and interpreting capacity, you become a much more sought after attorney or doctor or business person. And so that's right here on campus, and here's the homepage. That's also in your handout. Then we'll look at one at the Pima Community College. They also have 2 degree programs in translation and interpretation studies. Associate degree is in interpretation, and this certificate is in translation. And you can check on there and see how much of those credits that you earn there could be transferred over to the U of A program. In some cases, you can do that. The great thing about both of the U of A program and this Pima program is that you're among fellow aspiring interpreters and you're among a lot of instructors, and so you're networking and you're getting to know about employment opportunities, and so you get a lot of information. And then you also have, especially in the UA program, you have internship possibilities. So they intern in legal and medical places around town, like at superior court, like at some hospitals. And so it's...
Is a certificate the same as certification?
Is a certificate the same as certification? No. And this is something we talked about before, is that when you have an academic degree or an academic credential or an academic certificate, it's not the same as being certified by the federal state courts or by ATA as a translator. So that always has to be made clear. However, these degrees become important if they become important if it's in a different language than Spanish, then it actually falls into some of the certification requirements. But in this case, for Spanish, you have to go through the whole procedure for certification. And this is both of these programs are for Spanish interpreters. Now, if you get academic credentials in another language, then you go into that language skilled, registered category to where you could actually get on the roster of the state and federal courts. And then, so you can look at this and look at the different, they got all the coursework that you take in there, but it's really useful because you get a network and then there's internship possibilities. So then we'll look at Sure.
Is the community college level sufficient to do the interpretation examination, or?
Yeah, when you're in these programs, the kind of work you're doing in legal and medical interpretation is actually preparing you to take the exams. And all the instructors know about the exams, and I know that the majority of students in these programs are interested in certification. And so it's a really good way to practice your skills in order to take the examinations.
But you know of students that have completed that associate's degree and then took the examination, the interpretation?
Oh yeah. Definitely. I mean, just like any training program, getting a degree, you're getting a lot of intensive experience doing the same thing that is called for on the examination. And so when you're doing consecutive and you're doing it in the fields of legal and medical, you're actually practicing for that exam and you're improving your skills. And so getting a degree, that's one of the advantages. You're preparing yourself for certification. I mean, you have an academic credential, it doesn't mean you're certified, but you are preparing for a career as an interpreter. And, you know, like I said before, there are some people who find work without being certified, and they can use an academic credential in that sense for work that doesn't require certification. Now, if you're in the federal or state courts, you wouldn't be able to work there with an academic degree. Could we go to the third one is at NCI, and that's us. Since we've been in this business over 30 years, we have the best interpreter training programs in the country, I think it's fair to say. Now, when you look at all those other resources, you're going to see different training opportunities at different places, and you're going to see different training opportunities and self-study opportunities for other languages than Spanish too. But just to look at the legal button up here, if you go to this legal link, you'll see there's our flagship program, and we have the brochures for this over on the table. You probably all have one. That's our flagship program, and we've been doing that for over 30 years, and it's 3 weeks, and it's in the summer, and It has a lot of lectures that introduce you to the modes of interpreting, introduce you to the standards and protocol, so you get that legal procedure. And then the majority is spent in labs doing simultaneous, consecutive, and sight translation. And so in 3 weeks, you just get a lot of intensive experience doing that kind of interpreting, using authentic legal documents. And where did we get these documents? We got these documents from the same place that the test developers get them. You know, we get authentic scripts and then we'll work them so that they're good for training purposes. Well, test developers do the same thing. They get the authentic scripts and then work them into a useful document for testing purposes. So this 3-week program is a great preparation. A lot of people use it for preparation for the oral examination and also for the written examination, because if you notice, the written examination draws on legal documents to create their reading comprehension items, for example. There's a best translation part of that federal written exam where you have to look at an English stem or an English passage, and then it's A, B, C, D. What is the best translation of that? So you get an English segment, and then A, B, C, D. What's the best Spanish translation? Spanish segment, A, B, C, D. What is the best English? And so that course is also very useful for the written exam, but mainly for the oral, because you spend all this time in the lab doing oral practice of the 3 modes that are on the test, 4 modes that are on the test, because there's a simultaneous Q&A, remember, that is expert witness. So we do that one too. It'd be great preparation for the state test as well, but can we go to the legal one again? So the Agnes Howery Court Interpreter Training Institute is our flagship program, been doing over 30 years. And then additional training opportunities. We have professional development workshops, so we do 2 and 3 day workshops in legal interpreter training. Proficiency testing, I told you that years before there was a medical certification test, and because Arizona was so slow, there was a need for this court interpreter certificate of proficiency. We developed that. One of our most popular courses, though, is preparation for the oral exam, the federal oral and written exam. So depending upon what cycle it is, and this year we were in a written test preparation cycle, people come to a 2-day seminar and they take practice exams. So we've developed practice exams in the written, practice exams in the oral, and they take those exams, and then we do analysis of why you got it right or why you got it wrong. And there's actually been, over the years, a lot of positive feedback about these courses because it has helped a lot of people pass. And so the test prep courses are something that is really beneficial that we've been doing. Self-study products. Now, a lot of beginning interpreters should probably do some self-study products like legal interpret tools. There you get instruction and practice on the 3 modes of interpreting, and you get some recordings so that you can do simultaneous and consecutive, and you can hear a passing rendition, and you're instructed on the procedures to use the exercises that are in the manual to record yourself and actually do the exercises. And then you get models of what was a good rendition so that you can score yourself. And then training schedule, all of these links with some of our prep courses have a training schedule. And so you could look and see what we're doing, but you could also do the Notify Me. So we use the Notify. Is that me? We do the Notify Me. You see this right there? So that is one way when, if enough people are interested in something, we'll go ahead and arrange to hold it, depending on if they're congregating in one particular area. So you can just see some of our schedule on the institutes and workshop. We also have prep courses for the state exams. So we were one of the first ones to develop that 135 item written test for state certification in Spanish. Well, it's actually for more than Spanish because all languages have to take it because it's an all English test. So you got to take that before you go into their other procedures. So we're offering that test prep course, and we've gotten feedback from people that, you know, they want to know what the test is like. And so we give them a full-blown 135 item test, and we administer it under testing conditions. That's what we do in all our test prep courses. So if you get to where you want to take the written exam for state or federal, you should definitely try and take a test prep course with us. So if we go back to the NCI, let's look at medical. So just like with legal, medical, we have our corresponding flagship program, the Agnes Howery. There we go. The Agnes Howery Medical Interpreter Training Institute. That one is 2 weeks, not 3 weeks. We may develop into a 3-week institute. But again, it capacitizes you to pass the examinations, the national examinations. And we also administer our own medical interpreter certificate of medical interpreter competency examination afterwards. Additional training opportunities, we offer anything from 2-day to 3-day to 1-week medical training programs. And just like with the legal, we have the self-study products so that you can buy medical interpret tools, medical essentials. These prepare you for the tests because they're based on authentic doctor-patient interviews, authentic site translations, and things that happen in the medical setting. And then again, we have our schedule. So that's what we have to offer at NCI, and I invite you to check back. I invite you to check back on all websites that you look at because things change, and they might even change the format of a test. So things don't stay frozen as far as certification. And last but not least, I'd like to plug our Fundamentals of Court Interpretation. This is a book that was written by our former director, and Holly Mickelson, who works at the Monterey Institute of International Studies, and Victoria Vasquez, who's the Director of Interpreting Services here in Superior Court. And it has everything about court and medical interpretation that you would want to know in here. This isn't a book you read cover to cover. And it's not a book that you want to lug around too much either. It'll throw your back out. But it's a book you leaf around and find what's important to you. And it has information about everything we've talked about tonight. And you can get it at the Intrans Books, which was one of the links I gave you. So I think that about wraps it up unless there's any questions. And remember, you can email. You have my email on the front page, so if you have any questions down the line, feel free to write me, and I'll do my best to help you out. But thank you for coming.